Hi everyone. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning how to find the midpoint of a segment. Remember, the midpoint is always directly in the middle between two endpoints. We know that if we have two values, the number in the middle can be found by adding the two values and dividing by 2. In other words, finding the average. Therefore, the formula for the midpoint goes along with this. It says given any two ordered pairs, x number 1, y number 1, and x number 2, y number 2, the midpoint is given by the following formula. The midpoint is equal to x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. All this formula is really saying is that if you take the two x values, x number 1 and x number 2, and add them and divide by 2, you will find the x value of the midpoint. If you do the same thing with y, add the two y values together, and divide by 2, you will find the midpoint of the y value. This is because when you add the two values and divide by 2, you're finding the average or the middle of those two numbers. Let's look at a couple of examples. We're asked to find the midpoint of the segment that has endpoints at 5, -10 and 3, 6. In this example, we can call either one of these x values as x1. So I'm simply going to use the first point as x1 and y1, and the second point as x2 and y2. It doesn't matter which one you call x number 1 and x number 2. So according to my formula, in order to find the midpoint, we're supposed to take x number 1 plus x number 2 and divide by 2. We're also supposed to take y number 1 plus y number 2 and divide by 2. That means our answer is 5 plus 3, or 8, divided by 2, which is 4, and -10 plus 6, which is -4 divided by 2, or -2. The midpoint of the segment is at 4, -2. Notice we can kind of tell this makes sense because in between 5 and 3 would be the number 4. And if we had a number line going from -10 to +6, -2 would be halfway between those two numbers. Let's look at another example together. First, let's kind of think this through. If we were on a number line, halfway between -3 and +3 would be 0. Now let's look at how the midpoint formula makes this work. If we look at the midpoint formula, it says x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So -3 plus 3 is 0. So we have 0 divided by 2, which is 0. We have -5 plus 2, which is -3. And -3 divided by 2 is -1.5, or -1.5. So the midpoint is at 0, -1.5. Now I'd like you to try a couple of examples. Remember, as you're substituting, it does not matter which one of these you call x1 and which one you call x2. Just remember, if you were to call this one x1, then the -5 would have to be y1. And if you call 3 x2, then 9 must be y2. So use your formula and set up the problem. x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Remember, always add first and find the sum, then divide that answer by 2. I'm going to have you pause the video for just a moment, and I'd like you to go ahead and try these problems. You'll bring those to class with you tomorrow. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance now to work both of those problems. So now we're going to try something a little more complicated. Notice in this example, instead of asking you for the midpoint, I have told you what the midpoint is. The midpoint is at 4, -9. I've given you one of the endpoints, which is at -3, -5, and I've asked you to find the other endpoint. There's a couple of different ways that we can do this, but one of them involves using the midpoint formula. I know that if I add x1 and x2 together and divide it by 2, I'm supposed to get the x value of the midpoint. I'm going to call that x sub m, where m stands for the midpoint. In this case, instead of adding the 4 and the -3, I'm only going to substitute one of those as an x value as x1 or x2. Because remember, x1 and x2 are supposed to stand for the two endpoints. I don't know both endpoints. So I'm going to call this x1. And I'm going to call this y1. This is my midpoint value. So I could set up an equation that says the x value of the midpoint, or 4, is equal to the first x value, which I'm calling -3, plus the second x value, which I don't know. So I'm going to call that x sub 2 divided by 2. Now I have an equation which I could solve. I start by multiplying 4 times 2 to get the 2 off the denominator, and I have 8 equals -3 plus x number 2. If I add 3 to move the -3 to the other side, I now have 8 plus 3, or 11, is x number 2. I can now do the same thing to solve for y. -9 is the y value of the midpoint. So -9 is the answer that I get when I take y number 1 and y number 2 and add them together. I don't know what y number 2 is, so I leave that as a variable. And I divide by 2. I start by multiplying by 2, so -9 times by 2 is -18, and that equals -5 plus y2. If I add 5, I find that I now have -13 equals y2. So the point that's missing has an x value of 11 and a y value of -13. And that's the endpoint of the segment that I'm looking for. So that's B. I can tell this makes sense because if I were to add -3 and +11 together, I get +8, and +8 divided by 2 is 4. If I take the y value, y1, -5, and add -13, I get -18, and -18 divided by 2 is -9. There's another method that we could use to find the endpoint in this problem. We know that the midpoint of AB is at 4, -9. So I'm going to draw a segment. It doesn't matter what the segment looks like. I know that the midpoint is at 4, -9. I know that the endpoints are called A and B, and A is at -3, -5. First, I'm going to find the distance between these two x values. So I'm going to subtract 4 minus -3, which is really 4 plus 3, or 7. So the distance from A to the midpoint is 7 units. I can see that I would have to add 7 to get from -3 to +4. So if I add 7 again, I'm going to be at 11, which would put me at endpoint B. Now to find the y value, I do the same thing. The distance between -5 and -9 can be found by subtracting the larger number minus the smaller number, and -5 plus 9 is really 4. So there's 4 units between the two y values. To get from -5 to -9, I would have to go down 4. So I'm going to go down 4 more, and -9 minus 4 is -13. And I notice that I get the same answer I did a moment ago to find the end point. So now I'd like you to try this example. You can use either of the two methods that I showed you in the last problem. You can use the fact that the midpoint is the x value 1 plus x value 2 divided by 2, and that the y midpoint is y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Remember, you'll replace xm with the midpoint of the x value. Then the end point is at 5, 4, so x1 would be 5, y1 would be 4, and then you would solve for the missing variable. Or if you prefer, you could draw a segment and find the distance between the two x values, and then continue that pattern. Then find the distance between the two y values and continue that pattern. Again, I'd like you to find that answer and then bring that to class with you with your notes tomorrow. And that's the end of today's lesson on finding midpoint.